So just to introduce these guys, Yota is one of my students, and I've been doing a lot of work about an hour and a half north of here, and Yota's been working with me. And in the car on the way up, we always start talking about food, and then we talk about food the whole time, an hour and a half up and an hour and a half back. And Yota's particularly passionate about food. In fact, the project that we're working on, he actually has done as a design for it. So it's a farm, an old dairy farm, and we're looking for alternative agricultural practices that are more sustainable. And Yota's idea was, why don't we create one of these centres where, as a restaurant, people can come and understand how to farm sustainably, and then all of the food in the restaurant is sourced from just around the farm. And this led to Yota then discussing with me about foraging. Whenever we went out, he'd always have his head down and be pulling things out of the ground and giving things for me to taste. And he gets really excited about it. And in fact, that's what I like about all of these people, and that's why I invited them to speak today. For some reason, they're all obsessed with what they're doing. So the way we're going to run this conversation is I'm just going to ask Frank and Yota some questions about how this kind of foraging interest started, and we'll just develop it from there. So my first question is to Frank, who is the sous chef at Matterhorn. I believe some of you had dinner there last night, and it was fantastic. So Frank, can you just tell the audience what was the catalyst for your interest in foraging?
So I met a guy a few years ago. I was already interested in foraging and interested in wild foods, but I met this American chef who'd come over from New York to spend a year in Wellington. And I started working with him, and we became quite fast friends. And he was extremely passionate about foraging and about wild food. And he just couldn't believe the abundance and the diversity of what was around, just literally everywhere in Wellington. And it really opened my eyes. When I went out with him, he was just so passionate about eating absolutely everything he could find, and anything that looked interesting, he'd just put it in his mouth. And I just found it really inspiring, and obviously some of these things turned out to be revolting, but often we had a lot of success. And then we had the joy of applying these interesting and unique ingredients, which for a chef is really important, and applying them to our job and applying them to create a new experience for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for our customers ultimately.
Okay, so where do you think this passion, I guess different things start in different disciplines, different approaches to wild start in different disciplines, and for chefs it seems like it's the foraging thing. So what do you think is the attraction of foraging? Yota, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. I think it's, for me especially, I was coming from after doing my undergrad, and I wasn't sick of it, but I was kind of just looking for a change. And I managed to work my way into a kitchen and work hard enough to kind of start to get the respect of the chefs and learn about everything. And I came to Matterhorn after a while, after about a year and a half, and I started to meet all these people who were really, really into what they do, like Frank, and they kind of showed me around and said, "Oh, come meet us an hour before work, and we'll just go for a little walk." And I didn't really know what to expect, but they went around and they picked something out of the ground and just said, "Taste this." And I said, "Oh, I don't know, it's off the side of the road, is it okay to eat? Just eat it." And there's this thing called wood sorrel, and it tastes of like a tart green apple, and it's actually really nice. And I just thought, oh, that's weird, I've seen it everywhere. And I'd never seen for a second that you could eat these things. And suddenly, all these things on the side of the road, I'm looking around to see if I can eat them. And it's really eye-opening to see that kind of, see that kind of information that's suddenly, it's been around you the whole time, and suddenly you see it right in front of you. And I knew it'd have some sort of application to landscape architecture, I guess, like it does now, I guess, in the future.
Yeah. So, Frank, what about you? You told me a story about how after the earthquake, your next door neighbour had a conversation with you. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, he was really concerned. He's got a baby and a toddler, and he came over to see me and was like, look, if this happens again, we need to make sure we support each other and through anything that might happen. And, you know, I was able to reassure him through a few different means, but ultimately saying, listen, if the worst came to the worst and we were trapped and we couldn't leave Wellington and we were running out of food, we live in a valley where there is an abundance of wild food and there's a lot of nutrition. And if we had a few basics to cover ourselves, we really could actually sustain our children and ourselves fairly well.
So what do you think, is that on? Is it on?
Don't think so.
No? No, it's not on. So, oh, okay. Can you do that? Because I don't have my glasses with me. So anyway, what do you think it is about Wellington? So I was kind of interested, the conversation came from the guy in, was it Canada or something?
He was from New York.
From New York.
Yeah.
And I thought, he's really interested in this idea of abundance in Wellington. And so I asked Frank, well, what is it about Wellington that makes the foraging so abundant?
I think it's just the diversity. There's a massive diversity from the coast all the way through to just coming back from there in the hills, and even in the urban environment. And you know, we were talking about the swathes before, and I mean that can be a forager's paradise really. In between buildings, just uncultivated wastelands, you can find amazing stuff, and I do.
That ties into what Philip was talking about. That idea of the gaps. So what you're saying is, and then this may be another one of those definitions of wild, is the idea of uncultivated.
Absolutely,
So this kind of stuff only occurs when people leave it alone. Is that right?
Generally speaking, I think so, yeah. That's right.
Yota, you bought, I don't know if you guys have got, but I've got fennel growing wild in my backyard, and up on the back of the Eastern Valley Ridge there, there's fennel growing everywhere. And Yota, you brought in this morning a little box of fennel. Have you got it?
I've got it.
Okay, so I don't know if any of you have eaten fennel pollen, but how much is it going for, a kilo or 100 grams?
It's pretty expensive stuff.
It's like some
It's like saffron. It takes a long time to harvest.
Yeah. So anyway, there it is, yellow fennel pollen, and what you dry the plant for two weeks.
I just dried it out on my kitchen bench for 2 weeks, and then just kind of shook the pollen off it.
Yeah.
Then that way you just get the pollen and not the stems and all the other stuff.
Yeah, and it smells amazing. And Yota was telling me about a recipe that Frank makes, which is what you roll a...
Okay, so at the moment I'm working on a project. One of my other passions aside from foraging is also charcuterie and curing meat. So I've cured a piece of pork loin. It's a little bit like a pancetta. But rather than just hanging a piece of meat plain, I've rolled it and coated the entire thing in fennel pollen. It was a lot of fennel pollen.
Yeah.
It took quite a long time to harvest
hundreds of dollars worth
and dehydrate that.
Yeah.
But it cost me nothing. It cost me nothing but time and interest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the smell's amazing. I don't know if you can pass that round, Yota, but the smell is like a highly concentrated form of that fennel aniseed scent. It's quite incredible.
And some of you guys last night may have had the oysters I served with a fennel pollen and apple cider granita, which was, another thing, utilising the wild products in the everyday cooking in the kitchen, which is something we try to do. This week's not been a good week for foraging, obviously, with horrendous weather, but we try to get out as much as possible and introduce as many of those wild ingredients into our day-to-day cooking.
Yeah. So does Matterhorn have a foraging menu? Like, do you ever do days where you come and eat just purely stuff that's been foraged?
That'd be amazing. I think the difficulty is really being able to go out and get things every day can sometimes be unrealistic. Yeah. So what we try to do is, there's a little bit of uncertainty as well to what you may find or not find. So we have our go-to ingredients that we use in particular ways, and we have methods and ways of using things, but not generally specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you know anybody who forages for a living?
Yeah, I do.
Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I met a guy actually online He's a pretty well-known forager in New Zealand. His name's Peter Langlands, and he works with chefs around New Zealand. And I was lucky enough to do a foraging dinner with him at a cooking school last year in December. And he's a really interesting guy. He basically more or less lives off foraged food. I would say he's managed to get away from outsourcing his food through corporations, I suppose you could say, to a really large degree, like quite an inspirational degree. I think it'd be quite hard for the average person to do that. I mean, he has a lot of knowledge, and he's involved with all the right people and has built a network around it. He's also an ecologist, and yeah, it's pretty amazing that he's able to do that.
Yeah.
But you know, he's really prolific online with his Facebook and his Instagram and everything. So he's constantly posting things about what he's finding and what he's eating, and you know, it kind of goes beyond just the urban foraging, which really is more based around plants. Because the reality is you're not going to go and hunt a deer in the back of Newtown wasteland somewhere. So, you know, but he finds. He does a lot of fish and shellfish, and you know, that stuff is all foraged, everything, all of it.
I mean, I suppose that's another thing, not coming from New Zealand, that surprised me. My next door neighbour goes out the front of our place, which is the harbour, and he dives for power. And I said to him something about swimming, how cold it is out there, and he said, well, I don't swim for pleasure, I swim for food. And I've never encountered that. I certainly haven't encountered it in Australia. So that's just another example of that kind of slight cowboy wild that you find in New Zealand that you don't find anywhere else, I don't think. There's a kind of engagement with what's out there and what's wild. People seem to be more raw, connected. What do you think, Yota?
I think. Sorry, what was that?
Well, what do you think about? Well, you're from Japan, okay? And,
Yeah.
you told me a story yesterday about Japan and how different the attitude was to what's growing in the city,
Oh, yeah.
for example. Do you want to tell that story?
I guess I was talking about how New Zealand's really unique in the sense that, you know, different to places like Tokyo, you don't have that town value. You don't have things just growing. You know, the urban, I guess the metropolis is almost overmanaged to the point where, you know, you have old ladies like scraping gum off the side of the street, bleaching pavers, just keeping it absolutely pristine and absolutely brand new. And I guess in New Zealand, or maybe in Wellington, we don't have that as much. And I think sometimes I think we're trying to be like the rest of the world too much, and we're not. We're in New Zealand, and I think part of that is having these pockets of, you know, like mini wastelands, like Phil said. It's these things that make this kind of unique and distinctive, and that's the kind of landscape that, you know, we can forage and really, I don't know, I think it's come to appreciate, or I think there's a different value there that's unique to where we are.
The idea of being able to live sort of hyper-locally to a degree and, you know, subsidise your diet or subsidise what we do in the professional kitchen is really empowering, and you know, I get a lot of reward out of it to be able to, you know, I'm able to share it with my children. I have a son and a daughter. My daughter really enjoys going out and foraging. She makes tea, so she goes out into the garden and picks various plants that she's learnt and brings them inside and makes a cup of tea. And for me, that's extremely rewarding, that she's learned enough to be able to do that.
Have you got some slides?
Just
So these guys are going to just show you a selection of the kinds of things you might find around Wellington.
Okay, so most of these are really common, really easy to find and accessible ingredients. They're all plants. You don't need to be a chef to cook any of these things or to use any of these things. Beach spinach, it's really prolific, especially back off the beach where the hills are, and particularly in Wellington. Obviously, when you go around the south coast, steep hills everywhere. This stuff is literally everywhere. It's a little bit succulenty. It has a crystalline quality under the leaf. And it has a natural salinity from being next to the sea, and it's quite delicious. Restaurants overseas and all around the world, the top places in the world are trying to use this stuff. So it's really a great product. So basically sticking with the theme of the coast here, ice plant, it's a succulent. Has quite a neutral flavour, slightly salty, watery. It's really pretty, and you know, it's fantastic for using in seafood dishes, shellfish dishes and things like that. The same with samphire. It has a natural taste of sea spray. It grows really in spray zones. It's really actually quite delicious. It's quite versatile as well. You can eat it raw, but you can also blanch it. It's a very popular product you'll find, particularly in England, where it does grow very prolifically. Seaweed, so a little bit unexplored for some people in terms of foraging and everyday use, but really it's quite versatile. Coringo, you can find anywhere growing on rocks. It's quite interesting because it dries out on the rocks and it naturally preserves itself just from the salt content that's in it. You can do whatever you like with it. I recently made a compound butter out of it and served it with smoked fish, which was delicious. Kombu, it's great for stocks. Basically, it's packed full of umami, so, you know, you've got salty and sweet and sour, and umami is the fifth savory kind of deep taste that you get most commonly with onions, actually. Kombu's great. Kombu make an amazing soup base. So kawakawa is everywhere in Wellington, absolutely everywhere. The berries are really intensely peppery and hot when they get to that point of ripeness, but the leaves are quite fragrant and almost like a peppery basil kind of taste and smell. We dehydrate it, make a powder out of it, or you can just blend it with vinegar for a vinaigrette base. It's quite versatile. So spruce tips maybe aren't that common, but an interesting product. I recently, not actually with spruce tips, but a few months ago, I found some baby little pine cones, literally so tiny, they're probably about the size of your little fingernail. And I preserved them in apple cider vinegar for about 3 months and used that as a base for a pine-flavored dressing, which, with all the essential oils of this baby pine cone, there's a hell of a lot of flavor in it. Now, wood sorrel, interestingly, when I was looking at images of wood sorrel online, it's pretty much seen as a pest, but it's really quite a delicious small leaf that tastes very sharp and lemony. It's full of oxalic acid, so you don't want to eat a big bowl full of it, but it's a pretty addition to a salad or even a dessert. Pineapple weed, looks like chamomile, smells like pineapple. You can use it for a tea. You could use it for any number of things, really, but it's mostly for infusions and things like that. Fennel is just so abundant in Wellington, it's literally everywhere, and I think we just tend to see it as a weed that gets out of control in our gardens. But it's incredibly useful right through from spring through to the end of summer. The fronds are excellent quality and very aromatic. The buds, again, delicious. The pollen is probably the prize product that you'll get off it, as we were talking about before. And then once it's gone to seed again, you can harvest the seeds and use them. And this stuff just grows everywhere, particularly in the urban wild. Watercress, again, pretty common, pretty useful. Most of these are sort of salad greens and things that we can use just to make daily food a little more interesting. It's very peppery. And then nasturtium, the same. Everyone's probably familiar with that. Goes really well with seafood dishes, goes really well with all kinds of things. And it's really pretty. The flowers are also really nice to use. Yeah, miner's lettuce is a bit lesser known, perhaps. Tends to grow in kind of damp areas. Quite a thick, succulent-y leaf. Quite a delicate taste. Really quite delicious, and really quite unusual looking and really striking on a plate. Chickweed grows everywhere. If you look closely, you'll probably see it growing out of a crack in the sidewalk. It's a really nice thing to use for like a wild pesto. It's really creamy. It's really nice, but not to be confused with milkweed on the right-hand side, which is pretty toxic and looks very similar. What I know about milkweed that's quite interesting is apparently it's been used as a herbal remedy for treating melanoma, because apparently the sap that comes from the stem is so highly acidic. So you definitely don't want to confuse the two. But chickweed is fairly recognizable, particularly by those little white flowers in the springtime. And wild carrot, I steered away from wild carrot for a long time, even though it grows everywhere, purely because it's so similar to one of the most poisonous plants around. And they're quite difficult to distinguish from one another. So the left side, that's Queen Anne's lace, which is the flower, the crown. You can see that they really are very similar. The easiest way to tell the difference is the scent. One smells like carrot and the other doesn't. Also, wild carrot has little hairs, little tiny hairs that grow on the stem, which are quite distinguishable, and hemlock has a very distinguishable red line that runs down the stem, and that's really the main difference. But wild carrot tastes like carrot, great for a salad, great for tossing through a vegetable dish. And I think that's it.
Okay, so I think that'll wrap up this little part of the talk.